Lab, as always. My name is Heather Akers. I'm the incoming AIA president for 2026 of the AIA Fort Lauderdale chapter. And I'm really honored to be introducing tonight's speaker. Jonathan is an architect committed to transformational design for underserved communities. As CEO of Moody Nolan since 2020, he has led the firm's expansion to 12 locations with 350 professionals, prioritizing impact over growth. Continuing his father's legacy, he champions diversity in architecture, earning Moody Nolan the 2021 AIA Architecture Firm of the Year Award, as well as the AIA Young Architect Award. A dedicated mentor and community leader, Jonathan actively supports at-risk youth and development projects, striving for a more just and equitable future. Without any further delay, let's give a warm Fort Lauderdale welcome to Jonathan Moody. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming out. And I think we were talking about, so I spent some time in Los Angeles, and it's not quite the same as Miami, Fort Lauderdale area, but I think culturally there's definitely like takes a while to get around. Maybe maybe people show up a little later. They do the best they can. But thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here. So I'm just hoping to tell you a few stories. I know we're talking about a lecture, right? But these are my opinions and just some experiences I've had. I think one of which I'll start with the fun AIA thing. I'm a big believer in design, and I think with all the different challenges that we're dealing with, I gravitate toward the idea that design at its core is kind of like imagining this future and trying to create this future, and like why would we not want to try and make that better, right? Or like could we make that better with the things we have, and how do we try to do that? But stories, right? So I just have my Angelo quote, because I do feel like at times, it has a history of being a little bit exclusive. And so I think a lot of times when I get to tell my story or tell other stories, I come across so many people who like, man, I wish, I have this angst or this thing inside of me that says, there's this untold story that has to be out there. And so I want you to want to tell your story and have that opportunity like I did. And what I've also said, I've learned to accept that I'm a reader. Like I don't know how that happened. It first started as people recommending books and certain things, and then I think I set a goal of, trying to read a book a quarter, and then before you know it, it's like a book a month. But I read a lot of books, and I learn a lot of things. So, and I think they help give me some conclusions. So I'll tell you, tonight's a combination of my opinions, my stories, and how those really relate to some other stories. So yeah, let's get right into it. So
I read that one.
Yeah, so here's a couple of books that I enjoy them for different reasons. I'll say the conclusions I got out of them is what I would call my version of patriotism. And similar to design, A Promised Land book by Barack Obama is this imagination not of the world the way it is, or not America the way it is, but like, man, this is the promise that could be, and how do we try and create that? So I really like the way you think about patriotism in that way. And then the controversial one on you're right, 1619 Project. I'll give you the bookend of it. The beginning, she talks about her father, military background, flies this American flag. But really, like the idea of her family and background of patriotism being like, fought for this country and shouldn't have the right to kind of represent and shouldn't you demand of this country what should be better for you or what you want. And then the other end of it is basically, from 1619 to 2025, or 406 years or whatever it is, the reality of the conclusions of some of these histories and what America is. And I appreciated her perspective, and I'd say I agree with it in different ways about one of the biggest gaps, because the title of my story tonight is about closing the gap, is talking about the wealth gap, and she particularly talks about Black wealth. But I would argue, and she argued this, that the bigger gap is not necessarily the wealth, it's the perception. So if you think about this gap, what does it mean? On average, they say if you hold, wealth, it's, the belief is that for every $100 of white wealth, that there's, if you poll most Americans believe there is a gap. Most Americans would say that they believe the gap is $90 to $100 or $80 to $100. The reality is the gap is $100 to $10. And so I would not argue, because people get caught up in $90, that's the gap. I would say the bigger gap is the gap in perception of saying, no, I believe there's a gap, but believing that it's only $10 or $20 versus it being $80 or $90. Because that's what leads to attitudes that say, well, if you would just work harder, or if you would just try hard, and it's like, and that was her argument at the end of the book. After 400 years of American history, it doesn't matter how hard you work or how much school you get, you can't overcome that kind of gap. The actual stats on it are, at the rate of change currently, the gap is closing, and it will close in 700 years. That's the pace that we're going. And the reason that's important is because, particularly in this moment right now, the demographic changes that are happening from one generation to another, we're about to have the biggest, I think trillions of dollars in wealth from one generation, that there's not really a good plan of, I see a lot of young people in here, there's not really a good plan of how that wealth transfers and how some of those ideas move on. And, what I would say, is, the racial wealth gap is the same that it's been since the assassination of Martin Luther King. And it is time to kind of begin to think not the way things we want them to be, but not the way things are, but what is it we want them to be? How do buildings and the things and the works that we do contribute to that? So here's 3 more books, and I'll slow this pace so that you're not like, this book, that book. But they're really important because, 5 years ago, 2020, this is when I read these books. The one in the middle is probably one of the most relevant. It's Melvin Mitchell's book, and it had my dad on the cover. And it's meaningful because it's like tomorrow's the start of Black History Month. I read that book February of 2020, and like every February, I'm like, this year's gonna be the year that we do some of the things he said that we should be doing. And here we are 5 years later. So it's like another February's passed. And then, you think about that idea of Martin Luther King assassination and the wealth gap. And so this book on your far right is Tigerland, that featured a lot of stories about Central Ohio and how the community was grown and built. And I really, that was the first time I really processed that, man, my parents grew up in the 60s. Yeah. But the difference of being there's a big difference of saying all these things like civil rights movements, things happening, but it's when you think about it from I'm in high school, right? I'm going to prom and all the pressures that come along with, I got a girlfriend and this, and then, oh yeah, somebody was assassinated yesterday. Grew up in the 60s, that's a huge thing. So, but what Melvin talks about that I think is important is, and the reason I reflect on it every February, is we're in this world of architecture, we're in these buildings, we design buildings, but it seems like architects are the only people that are unaware of how it really works. Meaning we approach it as we're this artist and we're gonna come and create these amazing things, and it's no, everything in architecture is supported financially, right? And architecture doesn't come from, we wanna be these amazing designers. It's no, architecture comes from money. And everybody knows it except the architects at times. And his challenge was to say that this is a time, if you look at what's happening today and some of the conversations about new urbanism and gentrification and other things, I promise I'm going to get to buildings too. That as we look forward, one of our biggest regrets is to say, hey, there are all these amazing things, all these amazing opportunities happening right now. And if our limitation is that we limited, the scope to what an architect is, that we'll look back in 20 years and see all the wealth that was created in communities that we're working in and say, how did we not have a better or different impact on that?
So that was his real charge that says it's time for a new generation of thinkers that don't just think within the limits of what an architect is, but what is beyond that? The ideas of like buy the block or do other things, or like how can you be the owners or kind of the patrons where wealth will be created in these communities. So, all right, promise buildings, and so we go back 43 years. So that's my that image on the far left is my father and Howard Nolan. And we always joke that was a big PR picture from the 80s, because we were saying that was to show how technologically advanced the firm was, because that was the AutoCAD machine. Yeah, and on the I'm just gonna say this side, this one. That was our first Moody Nolan project, which was church, and that was a lot of how the firm started. It was like the people we knew were community-based people. It was church pastors, it was school teachers, it was principals, and so that was a lot of our early projects and work, and we partnered with a lot of people. This was from the 90s. That's my drawing when my dad won the Whitney Young Award. A lot of my family trips growing up were AI conferences. I thought that's what everybody did. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, so I thought it was straight, but over 40 years, what we talked a lot about was what we would call breakthrough opportunities, which was we knew the people we knew and we could find those opportunities, but if we could get somebody to take a chance on us, could we prove beyond what they expected, or could we exceed what their expectations might be? So whether it be, eventually, apartments and airports, or even like, this is a Cleveland School of the Arts, a performing arts project. A lot of them in historically overlooked neighborhoods where it was like, hey, we know this perspective, can we bring this experience? Or an all-in-one building, which was, can you create a whole community college in one building? Maybe it's a lot similar to what this building might be in Chicago. Or, a lot of gathering venues, because, my dad and I have a big sports background. So, basketball and football are a part of our firm's culture. Or even the fun, someone with a lot of money says, hey, can you do something for my airplanes? Or rec center into a hillside in Pittsburgh, because Ohio's very flat, so you don't usually stack rec centers, but we did one in Pittsburgh. I think it'll be done this fall. Again, as I said, my dad played basketball at Ohio State, had a sports background, but it was always a story of if you could just give us a chance, right? We could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that, and maybe beyond just the simplicity of really good architect or really good sports architect, but having a background of playing basketball at Ohio State, that we could bring a perspective that was different than anybody else and really know what the project needed. A lot of work at Ohio State. I'm from Ohio. So this is like Ty Tucker tennis facility. This is the Pelotonia Center research lab building. And this one is the, I think we're allowed to talk about it now. If not, I did. But on the Obama campus, right, like it's a presidential library, mostly a museum, but he had this idea of, this intersection of community and architecture. And it was hey, look, there's the big pristine museum thing, but could we create like a community center where people could just come and play basketball? So this is at the far south end of the campus. Ironically, even though we started after the library, it will be done before the library. I think it'll be done like early spring of next year. But it's just kind of like a basketball facility where kids can come and play. And all those things we learn about community and neighborhood development kind of inform the process and inform design through that. A big deal to me, I just flew in here today, but huge deal to say, hey, look, the first thing that people see when they come into Columbus, could you make that connection to say, and the kind of breakthrough moment or prove that someone from Columbus, who grew up in Columbus, could work on one of the biggest, most important projects. So the first thing people see when they come into the city is a big deal. So the terminal expansion is happening now. And what is our firm's history is really starting from a community basis, hiring a lot of people who, maybe they didn't get opportunities at other firms, but they know these communities. And we really just never left a market behind. A lot of firms, they say they only do 2 or 3 things. We talked about this idea of diverse by design, of like, kind of an elevated idea of diversity, not just people coming from different places, but people with different knowledges informing, and maybe what you learn from a hotel can inform a hospital, or what you learn from a hospital can inform a library, or a library could inform a school. And people from all these different communities with that background, that we all make each other better. And that's really what our firm is now. As my dad said, he said, architecture is a platform, and it gives us the ability to kind of have a lasting impact on society. So it was an incredible honor to be recognized with the Firm Award, I guess 4 years ago now. But it was really a reflection of all the people and the history of the firm that was built and the culture around it. So with all that said, I know I told you a bunch of big heavy books and all that stuff, but I have a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old. So I've also found that kids' books can be helpful stories. And I like kids' books because a lot of times what kids' books can do, not the big heavy phone book type things, but they can take these big complicated adult issues and say, hey, if I have to explain this to a 6-year-old, what does it mean? So this was one of my 2020 favorite books is, with a lot of the civil unrest, Daddy, there's a noise outside. And in the book is kind of like this family that experienced some things in the evening, and then the next morning they come into the kitchen table and they talked about what happened. So one of my favorite quotes from that book is, Dad, what is civil disobedience, right? So it overlapped because this is an important story for me, and that around that same time, we had to do these renderings, and I hated these renderings. They were horrible. This is I guess you could call it an affordable housing project. It's kind of a mix of a lot of things, but they were insistent on a certain style, and I remember we were about to finish substantial completion, and they asked us to do these renderings. So it's like, the building's almost done. What do you need new renderings for? Just take a picture, right? So we did these renderings, and then I'll never forget it because this was, I remember on a Tuesday before Memorial Day weekend, is national news kind of things happening, and we have to turn in these renderings. I think that same week. Thursday and Friday, things really start heating up. We went out of town on a Saturday, I remember this, and then I remember on a Sunday morning, client texted and said, have you seen the news? Like Sunday, 6 in the morning. And I say that because if a client is texting you at 6 in the morning on Sunday, something is really bad. And I had no idea, and it didn't take me long, because, yeah. And the reason this story is important for me is kind of a career story is, Memorial Day weekend of 2020, right? It's, there's a lot of civil unrest. And I think there's an important dialogue about what does it mean when people demonstrate their dissatisfaction with society on the work that we do. When your work is actually destroyed. And I had a lot of these questions I can't even answer about, was it intentional? Did they know this was a Moody Nolan project? Would that have made a difference? Did they know I worked on the project? Or was it just a random happenstance? I'll never know, but I think, it kind of brought us back. Yeah, it all came down. But it kind of brought us back to some of the fundamentals, which was what do we do next, right? And what can we do as architects? And it's we build. And the same dialogues we had at the beginning of this project were elevated in terms of the why of there's a need for this kind of housing in this community. And can't we rebuild it? And if we built it again, couldn't it be better? So they did, and they rebuilt it. And I keep the ribbon from the ribbon cutting at my desk, because it's one of those important circular stories of what happens when this happens to your work, or what does it mean? But the continued reminder of the most important thing, somebody needs somewhere to live. And this was a part of the story that needed to happen, is that we could help to facilitate that. So, and the acknowledgement that someone made an investment and that there's value, and that we should be thoughtful and intentional about what that investment means. So it's back open. I think it's been open for maybe a year now. And yeah, this was just before the world changed in terms of community engagement. The last in-person community engagement, there was this very passionate city council member in Cleveland And he kept referring to, like, as much as research and things that we had done, he kept talking about the importance of projects in the community, and he kept talking about the history of the Huff neighborhood, and he talked about the Huff uprising and how the library, we were hired to do a library, needed to, talk about these stories and it be a place where you could tell those kinds of stories. And I was kind of, and again, libraries are one of the funniest things because, it's public dollars that helps everybody, right? So it's a big investment from a city or a municipality, but, it helps to lead to jobs and education and all these things. But I had to go back and do some more research because I'm like, what is the Huff uprising? And it wasn't the way that the Cleveland newspapers had phrased it. They referred to it as the Huff riots. And there was an interesting parallel in talking about what does that kind of investment mean? Kind of one of those things that can help to close a gap of public dollars going towards the public good that needs to reflect a history. And it really, at the time, in 2020 for us, it became one of these projects that was kind of a rallying cry around all this conversation, that the project could be one of these places that we could live some of our concerns about what was happening in the world. And we said, well, what if, you had this idea of Sankofa, which is, a bird that flies forward while it's looking back. And it's like, what if the library could be that place when we talk about reflecting on the history of a community and what's happening in the world? Or like, could we, and it is, ironically, it's catty corner from League Park, which is where the Cleveland Buckeyes played. The stadium was no longer there, but the footprint was kind of etched in the landscape. And we're saying, well, could this library, echo that history and be a place where, you were looking backward and forward at history at the same time, like, and be that kind of space. So, that was a big informer of our design. I said this is like the postage stamp library because it's like 7,500 square feet. It's not a very big space. It's a little bit bigger than this room, but the importance of it is tremendous. And so I think that opened, I have this strange affinity for snow photography because I think it's very honest in Cleveland. And I think it really makes things, when you have a colorful building and a bunch of field of white stuff, it really makes things stand out. But this kind of space that's in there, we thought that this could be an incredible opportunity to always be sure that we're telling those stories, that people know that this is an important investment, and that when you can see the last few brick walls that were, the edge of League Park while you're in this library, and that I think they ended up deciding to house the sports collection for the Cleveland Library here, that this is an important story to be told. So through all that, I remember, when can't wait till things get back to normal, and I'm like, I don't like that phrase, but we're gonna come up with something better, and I do what a lot of people do when you're trying to find another word, I thesaurused it, and it got worse. It's like, yeah, but it is like, you remember I can't wait to get back to normal. And it's like, why would you ever want to say I want to be average, run of the mill, or unexceptional? And so I think, more than anything in our work, what we're demanding or what people are demanding of us, when you have passionate community members or people they want better. They don't want just average things. They want better out of what we're giving them. So, another story, kid's book, but personal story. I know there's a few students here. Interesting connection, because what people don't talk about with the Cohan and Jones book is it actually has a companion book, which is a kid's book. And I learned this actually, I was talking to Robert Easter at Hampton, and he actually told me that the artistry in this book was actually done by a Hampton architecture student. And so this is the kids' book. The reason that matters is one of the things I say I struggled with in undergrad is kind of what this young woman went through, which is, I'm from Ohio. I go to school in upstate New York, and pretty much everybody their peers are some variation of coming to upstate New York from New York City. And they would always ask me this question of like, well, where are you from? And I'm like, well, I'm from Ohio. And they're like, well, where's your family from? And I'm like, Ohio? And they're like, no, well, where are they from? And I'm like, I don't know, right? And so this girl, like in this book, the story that she's telling is of this story of an assignment at school. She goes to elementary school, and they said, hey, I want every kid to draw on the blank sheet of paper the flag of where your family's origins are. And she had this same thing. It says, I don't know. Like, I don't know where my family's from. I don't know where my story begins. Reason that matters is for this project. This is Charleston, South Carolina. The historic images of, map overlays of Gadsden's Wharf, and then the image on this side, you're right, I'm gonna get better at that, is the current day, and the red line is where the water used to be. The reason that matters this was the site, and again, the value of things does not always have to be financial, but the value of stories is, it's hard to quantify. But this was the site where literally it was the largest slave port in America, in North America at one point. Today, nearly 40 or a little over 40% of all African Americans in the U.S. can trace their first ancestry through this spot. And this was a story that hadn't been told. And so that, Gadsden's Wharf is we had the fortune of working with the late Harry Cobb, and one of the things that I learned a lot from him that he talked about was saying that really the building is not what's important, it's the site that's important. And the significance of that is, can't be denied. And if we could create a space where people would reflect and kind of, that touch point where people could learn that story, that line would still be there. But create, with Walter Hood, we worked with on this project called the Fountain, where create kind of a tidal effect that would raise and lower with the water, kind of echoing, what tidal effects would have been and at where the wharf used to be. And by the way, the EPA told us that we had issues where you couldn't dig down and actually expose the old wharf. It was there, but it was dangerous to do that, so we kind of left it exposed. But when the water goes down, you see the imprints of bodies. And that is a reflection of talking about the people who were lost in the Atlantic or the Middle Passage that's hard to talk about. But, and then you go into space where it's a building that it's not really about the building, it's about learning and reflecting. Because when you're there, you don't ever really experience the building as a building. You experience, site and landscape. So it's a little bit of an exercise of taking a back seat to the exhibit designers, to the landscape designers, and to the storytellers. And there's kind of two ends. One that both faces the Atlantic Ocean and the other that faces the city, and or faces the states. And at this end that you're looking at here is a genealogy center, where you can actually trace your roots and kind of learn those histories of what was there. And so it's an online resource, right? So I said, well, hey, before even the museum opened, I said, well, let me go online and see if I can see what's there. And I did discover, this was kind of a screenshot of a contract that was from Willis Spearman, who would have been my first ancestor who lived in Newberry, South Carolina, which, no coincidence, is not so far from Charleston, South Carolina. But this was the contract for his freedom. So this is for my kids and family when we came back to this site. It opened Juneteenth of 2023. I could give them that gift of that story of, this is where our family began here in the States. So, all right. Another book. This one is a tough read, I will tell you, because it's written stylistically accurate to, I will say this, the way that guy in the picture looks on the right-hand side, if you could imagine how he might have talked like 100 years ago, that's how the book is written. So it's kind of frenetically hard to read, but it tells the story of, it's the last evidence of a slave ship that kind of came through, Alabama. Oh, I'm just gonna drive me crazy. It's Alice Walker wrote the foreword. Zora Hurston wrote the book, but it was the last evidence of a slave ship that created Africatown in Alabama. But so Zora Hurston is the author on the left-hand side. But again, in thinking about the idea of wealth and architecture and how it's created and who gets to create it, these were significant because I had undergrad knowledge of who Zora Neale Hurston was, but then we get approached by someone who said, hey, I have this idea to create a co-working space for women of color, and we're gonna call it Zora's house. And it says, imagine a coffee shop, your homegirl's house had a baby, and that's Zora's house. But it's this amazing woman, and I will say one of the things that is very important for architects sometimes, Art Gensler, he has this quote that says, you hire good people and you get out of the way. Or sometimes you have this client that approaches you that is this incredible powerhouse of a person that says, hey, I don't know how to fund this, I don't know how to pay for it, but I've got this idea that's important. Here she is, her name's Elsie Johnson. This is her on the Kelly Clarkson show. And she was telling her story, and a lot of it, my job was to kind of get the right team members in place and get out of her way and get out of the team's way. Not to mention, I don't quite look as well as these ladies do in that pink hard hat. Because she's like, hey, this is the story I want to tell, and I think, if I can convince enough people, that I'm in control of this and that I can dictate the process, you get the kind of results that, I would say speak for themselves. So I don't quite have the exterior photography yet, but that is the image from the ribbon cutting that, I was happy to just kind of sit in the background and observe. Because, the type of atmosphere and the space that was created, when you control the wealth or you control, the funds that control a project, is incredible. Because, that image of the Black woman created this. But the idea of not just co-working, not just coffee shop, not just gathering space, but if you see in the image on the bottom right, those are beds. And that's what the project we don't talk a lot about, because, human trafficking is a real challenge. And a lot of times, a space to support women of color may be the only place you may be able to hide or live. And it may take an Elsie Johnson to say, I've got to do something to help this. And as architects, maybe this is where we can help to kind of close some of those gaps or be a supporter to create these kinds of environments. Another one of my favorite books, I know a lot of books, but Kwame Alexander, The Undefeated. It's another kid's book. This was one of my favorites to read to my kids. And one of the sections that he talks about are all of these heroes from history that we know so well, but people don't know enough about their stories. But also he lives on this note, and the undiscovered, or those future generations we don't think about, or that we haven't discovered yet. So this is in my hometown, and it was a very prideful thing to be a part of this story or be a part of this branch. And I had the fortune of working on a lot of projects around the country, but this was one of the first times I actually didn't have to get on a plane to go somewhere to design something, and it meant a lot. What we talked about with this library, in terms of community, and in terms of what it represented and how it interacted, was like that this could be a place where people come together. One of the the most, I think people know it, but they don't know it well enough about Dr. King and what it is. They always had, at any place, the image on the bottom left is the famous one with John Lewis, where they link arms. But whenever they have any demonstration, they come together on a site, they kneel to pray, and then they get up and link arms and march. And we talked about, could this library be a place, the Evolve thinking about a library being a place of connection rather than being a place of collection. Like, not just we collect things, but this is a place where people come and connect. And even could the building form itself kind of be like the different parts of community, of like living room, of like kids and adults that come together in that space to kind of create that feeling and that effect. And then particularly in this neighborhood, there's a history of disinvestment, and there's a lot of conversation about gentrification, what it means, but there's a clear line that we saw when we looked at this project, and it echoes and parallels a lot of communities where there was a once thriving neighborhood, and there was a once great place where people always were on their porches and always actively engaged in, visually positioned policing, visually engaging in their community. And then typically what the history shows is a freeway gets built, because that's usually adjacent to downtown. You introduce drugs in the 80s, and then all of a sudden, somewhere in the 90s, people stop using their porches and people kind of come back in. And so what we said is, like, is there a way that we can, use this investment, this public investment, to kind of begin to flip and be intentional with that history to give the library a porch. And give it the porch in the sense of like, for future generations, that what you see in this background is not always going to be that way, but that this would be the space that encourages you to go out and make the changes that you want to see. So this is the porch at the Martin Luther King Library. And for me, this is always one of those important things that I lose sight of too often, and I challenge our teams to say we lose sight of, is the best projects you realize at a ribbon cutting or a groundbreaking or whatever, it's not about the building, right? It's like, you get there and people are so excited because they understand what this investment means, right? And at this particular one, it was a unique moment in terms of celebrating heroes of the history that people had forgotten or weren't just aware of. Was that, believe it or not, in Columbus, Ohio, the first branch in the country named after Dr. King was when Martin Luther King Sr. came to Columbus to dedicate the branch to his son, who had just passed. And we kind of had a full circle moment. There's my father with Martin Luther King III to dedicate the new building to his father. So kind of this intergenerational, and again, that picture that nobody cared about the building, but it was this idea of the promise of what that building represented. And the idea of like, man, this is going to be my teen center, my homework help center, my children's area, was extremely important conversation to be a part of. And then me personally, no book for this one, but maybe those. This was the Carl Road Library that my dad had designed, and I remember with my preschool, because I grew up in this neighborhood, of saying all I knew to say was my dad drew this library when our preschool was going to go here. And so we had the unique opportunity years later to come back and design the next iteration of it. And a lot of those ideas of like the community had changed and evolved, and a lot of immigrant populations, a lot of just change, and a lot of like, we're close but we're a little bit divided, and we asked that question of, could this be another version of a place where people can kind of link ends and connect? And even the idea of people who are coming from 3 different worlds, because it's kind of on the fringe, whether it's urban, suburban, or rural, that like those 3 different views or vantage points of the city, or what this would be the place that you would come together on that site. And there was room, the red outline that you see there is the existing branch, which is a different time, a different era of thinking, where you put everything really far back from the street. But we said there was room to build the new library in front of where the old library was, and it helped a lot with, always in that budget of like, well, the moving budget and all this stuff, and it's like, oh, well, you can just build the new library and then move all the stuff and then tear down the old library. But we rushed because we said there's this important moment of when both buildings are on the site. And so who that is, let me get this right. On your left is my father and Steve Glass. Steve Glass was the project architect in 1980, whatever, when the original branch was done. And on the right that's actually me and Kyle Glass, who's the project architect. We said, what a cool moment of these 2 different buildings from 2 different generations, and 2 different teams, and all there together. But it was a wonderful project for many different reasons. It was an honor to be able to kind of work at my dad's side with it, and even with Kyle and his dad, and talk about what those stories meant. But to design an important building, which was this place of connection where people came from all different vantages. But probably more important is what a library or what an investment represents, or what we can be intentional about. So this is the children's area, right? But the truth is, in the same way that I've been fortunate, and this is touching on generational wealth and what does it mean, or what can we do? Because yes, my father gave me an amazing platform, and I in turn would say, hey, I could work on something like this. But that's actually my brother in the picture, and that's his niece and or my niece and nephew, his kids, because it's not for my generation. This branch is for their generation in terms of the ways that we look at it and see it. And that quote from that book that I always love to read to my kids Because at the end of the day, when we talk about heroes and figures and Martin Luther Kings and Wilma Rudolphs and it's like, but this is for you and you and you. This is for us, is the Kwame Alexander quote from that book. And so my dad tasked us, as he does many times, to say, couldn't we make our own book, right? And when we think about future generations of architects and what, again, different ideas of generational wealth and what does it mean? So we did, and one of his charges is, he faced many different health challenges, but he was always consistent of saying, with uncertainty about how much time you've got left or what you can do, it's like you've got to make the most of it right now. So this is, we're saying one of his most memorable quotes that he gave to us. And I remember the joke at the time in the office, so it was, it's kind of the end of the year, beginning of the next year. He called me into his office, and my joke was that I think he had went home, he'd taken, a few days off, and he had watched too much HGTV. He was reading, annual budgets, and he was looking at these letters of people who said, hey, I have this need, and I don't have the wealth to kind of address it. What can you do? And I'm saying that because he put all those things together of saying he's watching HGTV, he's seeing these letters of people who say they need help and what can we do, and he's looking at these budgets of charitable contributions, and he was like, we're not spending money on that anymore. Okay. He's like, we're going to build a house. I'm like, all right. And he's like, we're going to give it away. And I'm like, okay. So, and that's what kind of started this project, which was to say, hey, look, at the time it was supposed to be a tiny house, but I think by definition, tiny house is less than 600 square feet, and this ended up being 750 square feet. So it's not a tiny house. And one of the things I would say we did learn in that process, of all the challenging clients and all the people who can't make up their mind, or they decide this and then they go back and then this is over budget, architects are the worst. Trying to work with a team of architects to say, hey, look, how do we design a house and we don't do houses? Oh my gosh, we're the worst clients by far. But again, we had some of these ideas that we thought would be important about porches and neighborhoods and civic engagement, and how we could be a part of that, or how we could influence it or think about it with design. And how could we be as efficient as we could with the house? And I think part of the story of how it evolved, and saying, there's this broader conversation we were having about affordable housing. And there's an inherent human psychological thing with large numbers, we struggle. And maybe the best example of the opposite of that is those, if you can donate $1 a day to help one kid or something like that. But it's the opposite, meaning when the number, so every city's got a number like this. In Miami, or Fort Lauderdale, I would venture to say it's probably 90 to 100,000 units is the gap of affordable housing units that you're missing. In Columbus, more. In Columbus is 54,000. But the question of a wealth gap is so big. How do you ever overcome 54,000 people need units? How do we? It's let's not try to solve all of it, but can we do one? Can we do one thing to help one family? And can we just start with that? Was kind of the premise of that. So what could one house be, or what are those ideas? Section diagrams, all that fun stuff. But then as the process went on, that question got asked different ways. Not, can you build a house? But when we were seeking help, right, you started to realize that, maybe we have more influence and more wealth than we realize. In terms of, hey, can I afford to build a whole house? No. But maybe I can donate a piece of furniture. Maybe I can donate, like we all know all the teams of consultants and all. Maybe, landscape, I can do a quick landscape plan. I can do a quick MEP thing. I can donate, a chair or a couch or something. We got the house done, but it was not through our singular efforts. It was through so many collective efforts. And people started asking questions and saying, hey, well, maybe I can find like bedding or food or refrigerator, or somebody said, hey, I've got an old ring alarm or something that we could, and the idea is like, no, maybe I can't overcome this major thing, but maybe through little efforts, we can chip away at that. Maybe we can find out the ages of the kids we'll donate this house to, and get things for them, or have a, I think one time in the office they had like because the way I remember it is like from our wedding, I had like a shredder that was never opened. Like these wedding gifts you get that like, I need to do something with that, but I got a shredder and somebody gave me this one. But it's like, so I could donate that, and maybe that could be sold to raise money to buy, some bedding for somebody. But it was like a lot of those conversations, but it's like slowly, everybody, the way my dad talked about it is like, what seemed like a drop in the ocean began to create waves. And maybe not as an individual, but maybe collectively, these little bits added up to a whole lot. And maybe the whole lot added up to one house for a family member, and teams of people could come together. We're, as we said, we're in 12 cities and 12 locations. So could we do it again? Could we do it in, maybe not Columbus, but maybe we could do it in Nashville? And with that same kind of mindset of like, what does support mean and look like? So we did, right, in Nashville. And it's like, it's probably gotta not be exactly the same. There were some lessons learned, but maybe it can be a little bit different. But similar, but a little bit different in Nashville. Well, yeah, similar but different, right? But it's like, and maybe those little things add up, and they don't necessarily change the whole world, but they change the world for a few people, right?
Is that East Nashville?
Huh?
Is that East Nashville?
I couldn't tell you exactly where it's located. So, I'm not a Nashvilleian person. I can tell you where the one in Columbus is, but I think the story that I'll tell you that doesn't get told, and it was one of the criticisms we faced early on, was I felt over and over for something that was intended to be good. It was like, I asked, why is this so hard? Because it was like, whether it would be zoning, or whether it would be like one of my least favorite stories, to be direct, was the idea that said, hey, we worked with the community to get this approved, but for a family, and then we'd have people saying, well, can we schedule tours of the house before the family moves in? And it's like, if this were your house, would you want somebody touring your house? But it was always this criticism of like, because it was being given away, it felt like it belonged to more people, or people felt entitled to it. And I think one of the criticisms was well, what happens if you give this away and the person sells it, right? And I will tell you what doesn't get talked about, because that's the broader conversation about gentrification and the exchange of value. But what doesn't get talked about is, and because we haven't, why would we publish it? But that is what happened to the house in Columbus. But the reason it happened is because of long story about challenges with the healthcare system and unbearable healthcare debt. And saying like, hey, look, if I've got $100,000 of medical bills that I don't know I'm gonna sell this house to pay off the medical bills. Which brings me back to kind of the first thing, is, everybody knows that, everybody but architects knows that these kind of things come from wealth and power, right? And no, maybe we haven't solved affordable housing or addressed it, but we did solve it for that one family. And maybe, the idea that so many people contributed little bits to this bigger story, the story was an impossible situation was able to be overcome in terms of a healthcare challenge because of the wealth exchange that happened in this project, or couldn't have happened without it. And so I think, the conclusions that I get to in thinking about, I'll say the gift that was given to me of, this platform, the struggles that my dad had to go through for me to even be there. I don't feel that it is, and the idea of, being in the position I am in terms of, conversations that are more directly about generational wealth and what does it mean to be a business owner and all those things. But I think we still look ahead, and I still look ahead, and when I see how one generation looks at another, I see all of these projects and stories and opportunities where someone is making an investment, to ask myself the question of how could this, if these were my kids using this facility, or if this were my family, right? Or that picture on the top that she doesn't know is there is when we're at the Charleston Museum. Does my wife know I took a picture of her as she's reflecting on heritage and history, and what is the value of that and the meaning of that in their lives and in future life? And that image that you see there with my niece, who's the youngest family member, with my dad, who went through what he went through to design that basketball arena. What is the value of that? And I don't know. It's beyond dollars in a sense, and I think that is as much value as we get to be stewards of in the work that we do. It's still beyond the money, and we should work on that. And Amanda Gorman, she's a poet. She spoke at the inauguration 4 years ago. I think our challenge is not how do we, not how do we solve it all, or how do we, look at things that seem dark or seem impossible and say that we have to solve it all ourselves, but it's like, how do we be that light that's hard to see, right? Not if we're just brave enough to see it, but we're brave enough to be those changes and make those little differences. So maybe this is the only luxury part of tonight. So my challenge for you would be knowing the gaps and the challenges we have and the opportunities we have with design is how can we close those gaps? So that's my spiel.
Considering your phenomenal lineage and the pressures from, I don't know if it was pressure, I'm making an assumption, but who your father was,
Yeah.
and you seeing his process. 'Cause I used to take my daughters to my place of employment when I worked for someone else all the time.
Yeah.
None of them became architects.
Yeah.
So when did you know you wanted to do this? And was it always there?
So I think it was always there, but I didn't. It's hard to understand it because when you're always around it, you like one of the things. So part of the reason for going to Cornell, even though Ohio State's in the backyard, is I wanted to try to answer the question for myself of was I just interested in this because I was around it, or is this really what I was good at and wanted to do and that kind of thing? And to get away was important. And I guess the way I've answered or thought about that question is I don't think there were many different moments of answering the question, so do I want to be an architect? Given all that you said, my father and history, I'd say there were many different moments of saying yes, but they meant different things at different times. So early on, was I even interested in the idea of in middle school being an architect? Yes, so should I take things like drafting or or art classes, that kind of stuff? Yes. And then, colleges, do I want to major in architect? Yes, right? And then even the graduating from college, do I want to work in an architecture firm? Yes. And then, the big one 15 years ago, would I want to come back and work at Moody Nolan? Yes. But I would say the one thing that was different for me that I'd say, there's many gifts he gave. But one of the gifts that, it's hard to articulate or explain is, I think the question for him was, when one was asked well, what example could you follow, or what is inspiring you or leading you? And it's none. There is no example that he had. And the question I can always answer every time someone comes to me of, could you do this or could you do that? And it's well, yes. It's I've seen it done before. And so it's just kind of this weight that it doesn't exist of knowing what's possible because he did things that seemed impossible.
You're so amazing. So when the building ended up having to get demolished after it burned down, who came to so quickly to redevelop the project?
All right. So the reason that story is, there's so many layers to why that story, 5 years ago, the way the world was, so many things. But one of the reasons that was incredibly difficult, so it was for an insurance company, believe it or not. And so we couldn't talk about it. Like literally, like legally binding, we're not allowed to discuss what's going on. And so part of what was a challenge with it was, the way insurance adjusters and things look at value and assess value, it was we think they should rebuild it, but we're like, I don't know if they will. And I would say there was so much, maybe personally at the time, it felt like agony about people, or agony or criticism of saying, hey, how come we're not talking about this or doing this? And it's like, we are, I just can't tell you, right? Because it was like this was one of the most important things we could do was to be sure that this got rebuilt. So it was an insurance company, so obviously they had insurance. But maybe the story that, doesn't get told, that I would say we assumed incorrectly. Because you'd think if you built something a second time in terms of change orders and all of, and it was just as painful the second time. Like maybe not as painful of like, well, we knew what to look out for some drawings and stuff, but it was not, it took just as long. Like you'd think it'd be more efficient, but yeah, they, again, built into their financial plan was a backup plan for what if this all fails. And so even if it all failed, was that contingency of like, well, if it all fails, we should rebuild it and we'll still reach these revenues and these things from rents and those things. So they did.
Did you at least get the same fee, or did they try to cut you on that?
I think we got a CA fee, but yeah, they did push us back a little bit. I mean, we weren't redoing drawings, so.
True.
Right.
So the builder's risk at the end made them whole.
Yep. Yeah, but I think it was like a year later before we were even, kind of given the license to even discuss what had happened.
I didn't even know what your background was or anything when I came here, so I'm very, very happy to hear some of the ways that you speak about what you do, especially when you talk about sense of place, history, you're blending all of these, the social aspect of things together. Is the firm that you work with now your father's firm or your firm, does everyone kind of think they're theoretically like that, or are you unique in that?
Well, I think I guess from my chair, there's always the reminders around, what are our values, what are our core, what is the why that is always emphasized, and, trying to make sure that everybody understands that kind of this, broad idea of diversity, meaning like from so many different, is what makes us all. And so that's what we need. I don't know that I can say confidently that everybody kind of shows up and says, I would say confidently, I'm certain that there are many people that it's just a job and I just got to crank out some drawings. But it's but the ones we do reach and the clients that it does matter for, it matters. So that's
it's
kind
really
of
refreshing, and it's honestly like the path I'm in my life, but I don't practice, so I'm kind of thinking, it makes me think a lot about, especially with the little houses, and how you have that group of people who got together and did that. Really cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Stupid question. I'm shutting this soon.
Oh, good. But first of all, I really enjoyed this entire lecture. It was really interesting seeing you integrate history in a lot of these projects. My biggest thing is history, so just to see that come into fruition into a project, into many projects actually, is really interesting and awe-inspiring actually. So my question to you is, do you often find yourself either during the design process or just design in general, find yourself putting in history and a passion to implement history for others in your projects?
So, if I were to give you like I'd say like 97% of what we do is not that. Like, you know, meaning like, you know, like if it's a change order or if it's a detail or we're not, but it's like, but I would say that 3 or 4% of when it matters is when it's like, it's so important that it's kind of like, we gotta get it right. And it's like, it may not inform every moment of the entire project, but it's the, it's usually a difference maker of what, you know, what makes a place special or unique and not just another building. So a lot, sometimes yes, but not, it's not in everything. Like that's, but it is important, yeah.
Well, I have a question, a follow-up, not on this, but on the previous one. As your firm, as Moody Nolan has become more successful over the years, it has attracted more capital, which as you pointed out in front, you know, we're the only people who don't realize how much capital plays into what we do. But that's also a self-reinforcing system where the more you attract capital, the more high value, the more luxury, the more your projects stray from kind of the closing the gap that you're narrating to us here. So how do you keep a touchstone when the natural pull of consumerism in our economy is to pull you away from that as you become more successful?
So I can tell you about an idea. It's not fully fleshed out, and this is kind of the Melvin Mitchell, like every February, I think we're not there yet. We've been somewhat intentional, you're right, we've grown and been more successful, but I've maintained that part of who we are is we're medium-sized, and I know, you know, when you hear 350 employees, that sounds like a lot, but it doesn't sound like a lot compared to like 3,000 employees.
You're not HFA, you're not.
Yeah, but it's I think we enjoy the space of both, and I think it's also a part of how we continue to push for what we want to do is we want to have enough significance in terms of scale and capacity to be involved in certain projects, but I've seen, especially in the last 5 years, we kind of have reached we don't want to have to grow that we're dependent on them, because that's where the model begins to flip, and then all of a sudden, you know, you don't have as much ability to say no. And like, I like right now that, and I think it's the way the profession needs to go, is instead of saying how do we grow to be big enough to do everything, it's the how do we become better and better partners, that like if we need the capacity, we can partner and figure out a team that can deliver. But it gives us enough flexibility that if like we want to do a house or Zora's house or something, that we can still not feel like we have to turn that down, or we have to avoid it. And then the idea that I haven't figured out yet, and there's many reasons as to why, a lot of them related to the IRS and taxes, is I think, my opinion is that architecture is at a point as a service provider that, you know, we keep saying we need higher fees and more things to make better livings and all that stuff, but it's like, look, everybody else, when you look at other industries, says not how do we get more money, but how do we make the money we have, how do we leverage it to do more things? And this vision I'd love to create, but I can't figure out the tax part of it, is if there was a way that like we could be the investment or the capital part, so that if you're, and that kind of is, instead of like a 401k, that's more of like a, like, I don't know, I call it Moody Nolan investment or something like that. That basically saying both things are true. I'm working on a project that helps and adds value to that community, but the fact that I'm working on it, like, gives myself value and begins to say I can touch that kind of broader idea of wealth. Because again, this criticism is knowing that there's going to be a ton of investment in these communities that we're already working in right now. Is the biggest disappointment is in 20 years when we look back saying, oh my gosh, so much wealth was created, and who did it go to? The same people. And that's the like, how do we attack that? I don't have a solution yet. I mean, I've got different ideas, I've heard different things, like, my favorite one is like the self-directed IRA, where it's like a retirement account, but you can direct those funds toward real estate investment, and it's like, well, you could be the architect on that project. So plan around with a few things, but don't have out yet, but I would like it to be more direct. I'm creating wealth for this community, and that wealth gives me wealth, is what I'd like.
Just subsistence living.
Yeah, but that's the barriers that have to come down. But then there's these lawyers that put up these barriers to protect us and tax people. Yeah.
So my name's Alexander. Pleasure to meet you. I think the work that you do is really great. I think your position is very profound and necessary. I think what you're trying to address in a lot of ways is the contradiction between for-profit housing, right, and a lot of the social ails or whatever that kind of entails financially for a lot of people. How do you navigate the world and the field while maintaining your position? Because I think your position is very, like, I think not everyone is going to agree with you necessarily,
Right.
but I think what you're mentioning when it comes to, like, you're getting to the root of why we build, right? Why do we build? And I think sometimes people forget that, and we have to, like, how do you navigate that? I would like to know more about that.
I don't know that I think about it that way. I think part of how I look at it, one of the things I also think that I was fortunate is I grew up in a house where there were a lot of stories about the profession. Good, bad, all of it. But one of the stories was about, like, the things that you don't hear is, so you build a practice and you attract attention, and then, you know, some of those letters I was saying my dad was reading is there's all these people who have wants and needs, and it feels like, hey, shouldn't you donate to this cause, or shouldn't you donate to that cause? And my dad told me the story of, like, where he felt like he was going to go out of business from all the need for charitable contributions. And he asked Louis Scoop Sr., who unfortunately also passed away last year. He was I guess the second generation of Scoop Construction, which was a black-owned construction firm in Columbus, Ohio. They were my neighbors growing up. Is that the most important thing is to be successful. And basically, I guess we push forward with the belief that everybody may not agree, but the results will speak for themselves, and nobody can argue with that success. Like, or you can have your opinions of how that success is achieved, but it's like, but if we just continue to do it, and if we do it with the belief that it will result, like, in a better business strategy, right? It's like we just do it because that's why we think it's good business. That's how we operate.
Even if you're going to take a loss?
It just depends on, I guess, what do you mean by loss, though? That's what,
Like, I mean, obviously you're profiting, right? But because the business has to maintain itself, but at some point, like, you're going to take kind of like a loss on some of these contributions that you're making. So you're going to take a loss, you take a loss, and you find a way to overcome that loss.
yeah, I think maybe to address that, we tend to believe that, like, that eventually it works itself out. And that can be very uncomfortable at times, like this, you know, I'll say the current economic time with so much uncertainty is that, like, can you afford to take a loss on this project with the assumption that there'll be another project that maybe we don't, and that can be, there's a lot of sleep like that, but that's what my dad used to say, that every day is different, so.
I feel like that should be something that helps you sleep at night, because, you know, you're like helping people, right? And sometimes it isn't.
Yeah, but one of the phrases, there's a guy, his name's John Hope Ryan, he's out of Atlanta, he says, you have to do well to do good. And so sometimes it's like, all right, I'll touch on somewhat of the third rail. One of the conversations about the profession that's hard for us to come to terms with, because it's a hard conversation, it's not easy, is ideas of justice work and how you define it. And should you be profiting off of something that causes misfortune? And it's like, yeah, but if you go out of business, like Kim Dowdell and I did a presentation in the National NOMA conference a few years back, because we partnered with HOK, and it was a big part of it was a mental health facility, but we realized that there were a lot of people who would be critics saying that this is a jail or a prison, and it's like, I would be disingenuous to say to you like that, because the truth of the matter is there were very, like my dad's told me these stories, there were a few times in Moody Nolan's history without a project like that would have been controversial, there would be no Moody Nolan. And so it's kind of like, well, you kind of take things as they come and you kind of deal with it one day at a time. You try to say, hey, is there a standard of, like, at the end of the day, we say, if we can't tangibly say that we're improving somebody's lives, we shouldn't be doing it. But that's a gray area oftentimes, and sometimes it's how do we make sure, again, how do we make sure we stay in business? Because if we're out of business, we can't help anyone.
I think you're right about that, because obviously the business needs to profit because there are also workers who depend on jobs as well. And those people depend on you, so it's like very important, right, that the business does function in a profitable way, but also can still give back and stand for something that means more to everyone, right? So I really appreciate your message. Thank you so much.